Right now, all around you, passing through the walls of this room, through the blanket you're lying under, through you. There are thousands of invisible waves carrying music, conversations, weather data, text messages, GPS coordinates, the time signal from an atomic clock in Colorado, and probably a few hundred Wi-Fi packets that make up someone's late-night Netflix stream. You can't feel any of it. Not a single one. They're sliding through your body right now the way light passes through glass, and you will never, not once in your entire life, directly sense them with any organ you were born with. And yet these waves, these radio frequency waves, might be the single most transformative thing human beings have ever learned to create and control. More than steel, more than concrete, arguably more than fire, because fire you could stumble on, but radio. Radio you had to imagine first, and then prove, and then build from almost nothing. So let's talk about that. Let's start at the very beginning, before anyone had the faintest idea that invisible waves were even possible, and work our way forward, slowly, through the story of how we figured this out. And it is a story. A really good one, full of rivalries and dead ends, and a few moments of genuine, breathtaking insight that changed everything. But before we get to the people, let's just sit with the idea itself for a moment. What is a radio wave? At its most basic, it's a ripple in the electromagnetic field. Think of it like this. You know how when you drop a stone into still water, you get those concentric rings spreading outward? The water itself doesn't travel across the pond. The wave does. Each little bit of water just bobs up and down in place, but the pattern of that bobbing moves outward, carrying energy as it goes. A radio wave is doing something similar, except instead of water molecules bobbing up and down, it's electric and magnetic fields oscillating, taking turns pushing each other forward through space. The electric field creates the magnetic field, which creates the electric field, which creates the magnetic field, on and on, leapfrogging forward at the speed of light. Because that's the other thing. Radio waves are light. They really are. They're the exact same phenomenon as the light coming from a candle, or the warmth radiating off a campfire, or the X-rays at your dentist's office. All of those are electromagnetic waves. The only difference is frequency, how fast those fields are oscillating. Visible light oscillates incredibly fast, hundreds of trillions of times per second. Radio waves are much, much slower, relatively speaking. Some radio waves oscillate just a few thousand times per second, and even the high-frequency ones we use for things like Wi-Fi and cell phones are only doing it a few billion times per second. I say only. A few billion is still a staggering number, but compared to visible light, it's leisurely. And that lower frequency is exactly what makes radio waves so useful, because it means they have longer wavelengths, and longer wavelengths can do things shorter ones can't. They can bend around buildings, pass through walls, travel enormous distances. But we'll get into all of that. The point is, right now, just hold this one idea. Radio waves are ripples in an invisible field that fills all of space, and humans had to first realize that field existed before they could dream of using it. So let's go back. Way back. The year is 1820, and we're in Copenhagen, Denmark, and a physics professor named Hans Christian Ørsted is giving a lecture. Now, Ørsted had been thinking for years about whether electricity and magnetism might be related. At this point in history, they were considered completely separate phenomena. Electricity was electricity. It was what you got from a Leyden jar or a voltaic pile. Magnetism was magnetism. It was what made compass needles point north and what made lodestones stick to iron. Two different things, two different chapters in the textbook, no connection. But Ørsted had this nagging intuition, partly philosophical, that the forces of nature ought to be unified somehow. He'd been looking for a link, on and off, for years. And during this lecture, and here's where the story gets a little debated, because some accounts say it was a deliberate demonstration, and others say it was a happy accident. He placed a compass needle near a wire carrying electric current, and the needle moved. Not toward the wire, not away from it, but sideways, perpendicular to the wire. That's strange. That's really strange if you think about it. It meant the magnetic force wasn't pointing toward or away from the current like gravity points toward a mass. It was circling around the wire, like an invisible whirlpool. Ørsted had just shown that electricity creates magnetism. Not theoretically, not philosophically. Physically, right there, in front of his students. A current flowing through a wire generates a magnetic field that wraps around it. Now, word of this spread fast. Within months, scientists across Europe were repeating and extending the experiment. In France, André-Marie Ampère jumped on it immediately. Ampère was brilliant and intense, the kind of person who could barely eat or sleep when he was in the grip of a problem. Within weeks of hearing about Ørsted's discovery, Ampère had worked out the mathematical relationship between electric current and the magnetic field it produces. He showed that two parallel wires carrying current would attract or repel each other, depending on which direction the currents flowed. He was essentially proving that magnetism could be entirely explained as a consequence of moving electric charges. That's a huge deal. Two things that everyone thought were separate, unified, at least in one direction. Electricity makes magnetism, but here's the thing. Does it work the other way? Can magnetism make electricity? That question sat there, tantalizing, for about a decade, and the person who answered it was Michael Faraday. Faraday is one of those figures in the history of science who almost feels like he was written by a novelist. Born in 1791 in South London, his family was poor. His father was a blacksmith who was frequently ill. Faraday had almost no formal education. He left school at 13 and was apprenticed to a bookbinder. But he read the books. He read everything that came through the shop, and the ones on science captivated him. He started attending public lectures at the Royal Institution, including a series by the famous chemist Humphrey Davy. Faraday took meticulous notes, bound them beautifully. He was a bookbinder after all, and sent them to Davy with a letter asking for a job. Davy eventually hired him as a laboratory assistant, and from that position, with no university degree, no mathematical training to speak of, Faraday became arguably the greatest experimental physicist of the 19th century. What Faraday did in 1831 was show that a changing magnetic field induces an electric current. Not a static magnet sitting next to a wire, that does nothing. But move the magnet, push it through a coil of wire, and current flows. Change the magnetic field, and electricity appears. This is electromagnetic induction, and it's the principle behind every electric generator and every transformer on Earth today. Every single one. The power plant that's keeping your lights on right now, or charging the device you're listening to this on, it works because of what Faraday figured out in a basement laboratory in London nearly 200 years ago. But Faraday did something else, something more subtle, and in some ways more revolutionary. Because he wasn't a mathematician, he couldn't describe his discoveries in equations the way Ampère could. Instead, he thought in pictures. He imagined invisible lines of force spreading out from magnets and charges, filling the space around them. He called them lines of force, and he thought of them as real, physical things, not just mathematical conveniences, but actual structures in space. Most of the established physicists of his day thought this was a bit naive, maybe even embarrassing. The serious people worked in equations, in action at a distance. The idea that empty space was filled with invisible lines, it seemed almost mystical. But Faraday was right. He was more right than almost anyone realized at the time. Because those lines of force, that picture of fields filling space, that turned out to be the key to everything that followed. And the person who took Faraday's intuitive pictures and turned them into the most beautiful set of equations in all of physics was James Clerk Maxwell. If this story has a single pivotal character, a hinge on which everything turns, it's Maxwell. Born in Edinburgh in 1831, the same year Faraday discovered induction, which is a lovely coincidence, Maxwell was in many ways Faraday's opposite. Where Faraday was self-taught and visual, Maxwell was formally educated and deeply mathematical. He studied at the University of Edinburgh and then Cambridge, where he was recognized as one of the most gifted mathematical minds of his generation. But Maxwell had something that pure mathematicians sometimes lack. He had physical intuition. He could see the physics inside the math, and he took Faraday's field idea seriously when many of his peers didn't. Starting in the early 1860s, Maxwell set about translating Faraday's lines of force into rigorous mathematical language. He gathered up everything that was known about electricity and magnetism, Coulomb's law, Ampere's law, Faraday's law of induction, the fact that there are no magnetic monopoles, and he unified them into a single framework. 4 equations. That's it. 4 equations that describe all of classical electromagnetism. You might have heard them called Maxwell's equations, and they are, without exaggeration, among the most important equations ever written by a human being. But here's what's really wild. When Maxwell wrote down these equations and started working through their implications, he found something that nobody expected. He found that the equations predicted the existence of waves, self-propagating disturbances in the electromagnetic field that would travel through empty space. An oscillating electric field would create an oscillating magnetic field, which would create an oscillating electric field, and this leapfrogging pattern would radiate outward, carrying energy with it, requiring no medium, no wire, no physical connection. And when Maxwell calculated the speed these waves would travel, it came out to about 310,000 kilometers per second, which was, within the margin of experimental error at the time, exactly the measured speed of light. Think about what that means. Maxwell didn't set out to explain light. He was trying to unify electricity and magnetism, but the math told him, unavoidably, that electromagnetic waves exist and that they travel at the speed of light. His conclusion was as bold as it was inevitable. Light itself is an electromagnetic wave. Light, the thing we see with, the thing that lets us perceive the world, is just a particular frequency of the same phenomenon that Ørsted's compass needle had been responding to back in 1820. Maxwell published his full theory in 1865 in a paper called A Dynamical Theory of the Electromagnetic Field. He was 34 years old, and buried in that theory, waiting to be found, was the entire future of radio, television, radar, cell phones, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, GPS, satellite communication, all of it. Because Maxwell's equations don't just predict waves at the frequency of visible light. They predict electromagnetic waves at any frequency. High-frequency waves, low-frequency waves, waves with wavelengths shorter than an atom, waves with wavelengths longer than a football field. The whole electromagnetic spectrum was there, implicit in 4 lines of mathematics, 2 decades before anyone figured out how to actually produce or detect these waves deliberately. But Maxwell himself never got to see that happen. He died in 1879, at the age of 48, of abdominal cancer, the same disease that had killed his mother at the same age. He knew his theory predicted these waves. He believed they existed. But he never saw experimental proof. That proof would come from someone else, in a physics laboratory in Germany, and it would involve sparks jumping across tiny gaps in metal, a coil of wire on the other side of the room, and one of the most elegant experiments in the history of science. The man who performed it was a quiet, meticulous German physicist named Heinrich Hertz, and what he managed to do in a drafty lab in Karlsruhe in the late 1880s would turn Maxwell's beautiful abstraction into something you could actually see, something you could actually touch and measure and point to and say, yes, there it is. Maxwell was right. So let's talk about Heinrich Hertz. Because his story is one of those quiet tragedies that science is full of. A person who does something monumental, who changes the course of human civilization, and who barely gets to understand what they've done before they're gone. Hertz was born in Hamburg in 1857 into a well-to-do family. His father was a lawyer who later became a senator. Young Heinrich was one of those kids who was just good at everything. Languages, woodworking, drawing, mathematics. He could have gone in a dozen different directions. But physics pulled him in, and he ended up studying under Hermann von Helmholtz in Berlin, one of the great scientific minds of the 19th century. Helmholtz saw something in Hertz and encouraged him, even pointed him toward the big unsolved question of the day. Can Maxwell's predicted electromagnetic waves actually be demonstrated in a laboratory? Now, this wasn't a simple thing to attempt. Maxwell's equations said these waves should exist, but nobody had any clear idea how to generate them on purpose or how to detect them if you did. Think about the challenge for a second. You can't see these waves. You can't hear them. You can't feel them. You need to somehow create a disturbance in the electromagnetic field that's strong enough and fast enough to launch a wave out into space, and then you need some kind of receiver sensitive enough to notice that wave arriving. In the 1880s, you didn't have electronics. You didn't have amplifiers or oscilloscopes or any of the tools we take for granted. You had wire, metal, glass, and your own ingenuity. Hertz took a position at the Technische Hochschule in Karlsruhe in 1885, and it was there, in a somewhat unremarkable physics lab, that he began his experiments. His transmitter was beautifully simple. Picture two metal spheres, each about the size of a large marble, mounted on short rods with a tiny gap between them, maybe a few millimeters. These spheres are connected to an induction coil, which is basically a device that takes a low voltage and steps it up to a very high voltage. When you crank up the voltage high enough, something dramatic happens. A spark jumps across that tiny gap between the spheres. And here's the thing. That spark isn't just a flash of light. It's a sudden, violent surge of electric current oscillating back and forth across the gap at an incredibly high frequency. Millions of times per second. And according to Maxwell, any accelerating electric charge should radiate electromagnetic waves. So that little spark, that tiny crackling arc of electricity, should be broadcasting waves out into the room in every direction, like ripples from a stone dropped in a pond. But how do you detect something like that? Hertz's receiver was even simpler than his transmitter, and honestly, this is the part that amazes me. He took a piece of copper wire and bent it into a loop, almost a complete circle, with just a tiny gap at one end. Another pair of small spheres, separated by a fraction of a millimeter. That's it. That was his detector. The idea was that if electromagnetic waves from the transmitter reached this loop of wire, they would induce a tiny oscillating current in the loop. Faraday's induction at work again. You see how it all connects. And if that induced current was strong enough, a miniature spark would jump across the tiny gap in the receiver. So Hertz was literally looking for sparks, tiny, barely visible sparks in a darkened room. And he found them. In a series of experiments conducted between 1886 and 1888, Hertz demonstrated that when he fired up his spark gap transmitter, he could detect sparks appearing in his receiver loop across the room. Not through any wire connection, not through any physical contact, through empty space. The waves were traveling from one device to the other, invisible and silent, carrying energy through nothing but the electromagnetic field itself. Maxwell's prediction, made on paper 20 years earlier, was real. But Hertz didn't stop there, and this is what elevates his work from a demonstration to one of the great experiments in physics. He wanted to prove that these invisible waves behaved like waves, like light. So he set about testing their properties with a thoroughness that's almost obsessive. He showed that his electromagnetic waves could be reflected off metal surfaces, just like light reflects off a mirror. He showed they could be refracted, bent, when they passed through a prism made of pitch, which is a kind of hardened tar. He demonstrated interference, where two waves overlapping could either reinforce each other or cancel each other out, creating patterns of strong and weak signal. He even measured their wavelength by bouncing them off a metal sheet and creating standing waves, patterns where the peaks and troughs stay in fixed positions, and then physically walking along with his little receiver loop, noting where the sparks were brightest and where they disappeared. From the spacing of those bright spots, he could calculate the wavelength, and from the wavelength and the known frequency of his spark oscillation, he could calculate the speed. The speed he got was the speed of light. Think about what that means. An invisible wave, generated by a spark jumping between two metal balls, traveling across a room at 300 million meters per second, the same speed as light, reflecting and refracting just like light, interfering just like light. Hertz had proved that light and these new waves were the same fundamental phenomenon, just at different frequencies. Maxwell's unity of electromagnetism and optics wasn't just elegant mathematics, it was physical reality. Hertz published his results in 1887 and 1888, and the physics world took notice. Here was the experimental confirmation that Maxwell's theory demanded. The waves Hertz produced had wavelengths of about a meter, far longer than visible light, which has wavelengths measured in tiny fractions of a millimeter. These were the waves we now call radio waves, though Hertz himself didn't use that term. And here's where the quiet tragedy comes in. When someone asked Hertz what practical use these waves might have, he reportedly said something to the effect of, "It's of no use whatsoever. This is just an experiment that proves Maestro Maxwell was right." He saw no application. None. He couldn't imagine, and perhaps no one could have imagined in 1888 that these waves would become the foundation of an entire world of communication. Hertz died in 1894, at the age of 36, from a rare blood vessel disease. He never saw the first radio transmission. He never heard a human voice carried on the waves he'd discovered. The unit of frequency, the Hertz, 1 cycle per second, is named after him. And every time you see a number followed by Hertz on your radio dial or your Wi-Fi router or your phone's specifications, that's a small monument to a man who proved something beautiful and then was gone before anyone understood what it meant. So now we're in the 1890s, and the existence of electromagnetic waves is established fact. The question shifts from, do these waves exist, to what can we do with them? And this is where the story gets complicated, because the answer to that question didn't come from one person. It came from several, working in different countries, often unaware of each other. And the question of who actually invented radio is one of the messiest priority disputes in the history of technology. Let's start with the name most people know, Guglielmo Marconi. Born in Bologna, Italy, in 1874, Marconi was the son of an Italian father and an Irish mother. He was not a trained physicist. He didn't have a university degree. What he had was an obsessive interest in electromagnetic waves, access to his father's estate where he could experiment, and an extraordinary instinct for practical engineering. Marconi read about Hertz's experiments as a young man and immediately saw what Hertz had not, that these waves could be used to send messages without wires. Wireless telegraphy. No cables, no physical connection, just information riding on invisible waves through the air. Starting around 1894, when he was just 20 years old, Marconi began experimenting in the attic of his family's villa near Bologna. He improved on Hertz's basic apparatus in several key ways. For his transmitter, he used a more powerful spark gap design. For his receiver, he adopted a device called a coherer, which had been developed by the French physicist Edward Bromley and refined by the British physicist Oliver Lodge. A coherer is a strange and wonderful little device, a small glass tube filled with loose metal filings. Normally, the filings have a high electrical resistance, and not much current flows through them. But when an electromagnetic wave hits the coherer, something happens. The filings clump together, their resistance drops dramatically, and current flows. It's like the wave shakes the filings into alignment. You tap the tube to reset it, the filings loosen up, and it's ready to detect the next pulse. It's crude by modern standards, but it was far more sensitive than Hertz's spark gap receiver. But Marconi's real breakthrough, the thing that separated him from the physicists who were treating electromagnetic waves as a laboratory curiosity, was his understanding of the antenna. And this is worth pausing on, because the antenna is one of those things that seems so simple, it's almost invisible, but it's actually a deeply clever piece of engineering. Hertz had used relatively small transmitters and receivers, and his waves only traveled across a room. Marconi realized that if you connected your spark gap transmitter to a long vertical wire, an antenna, and also connected the other terminal to the ground, to the actual earth beneath your feet, you could dramatically increase the range of your signal. The antenna acts as a kind of amplifier for the wave. A longer antenna radiates more energy at longer wavelengths, and those longer wavelengths, it turned out, could travel much farther. Why do longer wavelengths travel farther? This is one of those questions where the full answer gets complicated, involving how waves interact with the atmosphere and the ground and the curvature of the earth, and we'll come back to that. But part of the answer is simple. Longer wavelengths lose less energy as they pass through obstacles and air. Think of it like sound. A deep bass note from a subwoofer can travel through walls and around corners in ways that a high-pitched whistle cannot. There's an analogy there with radio waves. Lower frequencies, longer wavelengths, tend to be better at bending around obstacles and following the curve of the earth. Marconi didn't fully understand the physics of why his antenna trick worked so well. He was an experimentalist, a tinkerer, a relentless optimizer. He just kept trying longer antennas, different configurations, different heights, and measuring how far his signals could reach. By 1895, he was sending signals across his father's estate, a distance of about 1.5 kilometers. He tried to interest the Italian government in his invention, but they weren't particularly excited. So his mother, being Irish and well-connected, helped him travel to England, where he arrived in 1896 with a suitcase full of equipment and a determination to show the world what wireless telegraphy could do. And England was the right place to be, because England had something Italy didn't: a massive navy. The British Empire in the 1890s was held together by ships, and ships at sea had a communication problem that was as old as seafaring itself. Once a vessel sailed beyond the horizon, it was effectively cut off. No telegraph wires stretch across the open ocean. Well, submarine cables did connect continents, but a moving ship couldn't tap into those. Semaphore flags and signal lamps only worked within line of sight. A ship in distress, a fleet needing to coordinate, an admiral wanting to issue orders, all of it depended on physical proximity. The idea that you could send a message from a ship to shore or from ship to ship without any physical connection, using invisible waves traveling at the speed of light, that was not just exciting. It was almost unbelievable. And the British Admiralty, to their credit, recognized it almost immediately. Marconi's first public demonstrations in England were dramatic. In 1896, he gave a series of demonstrations for officials from the British Post Office, which at the time controlled telegraph communications. He sent signals across distances that kept growing, first across a few hundred meters on the roof of a building in London, then across Salisbury Plain over a distance of about 3 kilometers, and then, in May of 1897, across the Bristol Channel, a stretch of open water roughly 14 kilometers wide. Each time the signal arrived. Each time the little coherer at the receiving end responded to the invisible waves, and the Morse code message was decoded successfully. The post office engineers were impressed, and more importantly, so were the naval officers who came to watch. Now, here's the thing about Marconi that you have to understand. He was 22 years old during these demonstrations. He didn't have a university degree. He hadn't published papers. He wasn't part of any academic establishment. And yet, he was standing in front of senior British government officials, showing them something that some of the finest physicists in the world hadn't bothered to pursue as a practical technology. Hertz himself had dismissed the idea. Oliver Lodge, who was a brilliant physicist and had actually demonstrated wireless signal transmission before Marconi. Lodge had sent signals over about 150 meters at a lecture in 1894. Even Lodge hadn't pushed it toward real-world communication. He was more interested in the science than the engineering. Marconi was the opposite. He didn't care about proving Maxwell right. He cared about sending messages. And this is where the story gets complicated, because Marconi wasn't the only one working on wireless telegraphy in the mid-1890s. Not by a long shot. In Russia, a physicist named Alexander Popov had independently built a receiver very similar to Marconi's, using a coherer, an antenna, and a grounding connection. And in May of 1895, he demonstrated it to the Russian Physical and Chemical Society in St. Petersburg. Popov used his device to detect lightning strikes at a distance, which is essentially detecting natural radio waves. He presented a paper on it, described the apparatus, and even suggested it could be used for communication. In Russia, to this day, Popov is widely credited as the inventor of radio. His demonstration came before Marconi's first patent filing. But, and this is the nuance, Popov didn't immediately pursue two-way communication. He didn't build a transmitter-receiver system and demonstrate sending human-composed messages back and forth over increasing distances. Marconi did. Then there's Nikola Tesla, who by the early 1890s was already lecturing about wireless transmission of energy and information. Tesla was thinking bigger and wilder than almost anyone. He envisioned a global wireless system, not just point-to-point telegraphy, but a kind of world broadcasting network. He filed patents related to radio apparatus in 1897, and the U.S. Patent Office actually granted Tesla a patent for certain radio circuits before Marconi. The legal tangle between Tesla and Marconi over radio patents dragged on for decades. In 1943, the U.S. Supreme Court posthumously restored Tesla's priority on certain key radio patents. Tesla had died earlier that year, partly because Marconi's patents had relied on circuits Tesla had described earlier. So, who invented radio? It depends on what you mean by invented, and it depends on which country you're asking in. In Italy, it's Marconi. In Russia, it's Popov. In certain American circles, it's Tesla. The truth, as usual, is that the technology emerged from the work of many people, building on Maxwell and Hertz, and Marconi was the one who most aggressively and successfully turned it into a working, commercial, world-changing system. Let's stay with Marconi for a bit, because what he did next is one of the great engineering gambles of the early 20th century. By 1899, Marconi had formed the Wireless Telegraph and Signal Company, later renamed Marconi's Wireless Telegraph Company, and he was selling equipment to the British Navy and to shipping lines. His system worked beautifully over distances of 100 kilometers or so, which was already revolutionary for ship-to-shore communication. But Marconi wanted more. He wanted to send a wireless signal across the Atlantic Ocean. And here's where the physics gets really interesting, because according to the best understanding of the time, it shouldn't have been possible. Think about it this way. Radio waves, like light, travel in straight lines. The Earth is curved. If you put a transmitter on the coast of England and a receiver on the coast of Newfoundland, there are roughly 3,500 kilometers of ocean between them. And the curvature of the Earth means that a straight line from one to the other would pass right through the planet. The signal should shoot off into space, not follow the curve. At the frequencies Marconi was using, the wavelengths were very long, hundreds of meters, but even so, no one had a clear theoretical reason to believe the waves would bend around the Earth over such a distance. Many prominent scientists publicly said it couldn't be done. They said Marconi was wasting his time and his investors' money. Marconi did it anyway, or at least, he tried. On December 12, 1901, at Signal Hill in St. John's, Newfoundland, Marconi and his assistant George Kemp flew a receiving antenna on a kite. The weather was terrible, and they'd already lost one antenna when a balloon broke free in the wind. And they listened. Across the ocean, at Poldhu in Cornwall, England, a massive transmitter was sending a prearranged signal. 3 dots, the Morse code for the letter S, repeated over and over. And Marconi heard it. 3 faint clicks in his earpiece. He handed the headphones to Kemp, who heard them too. Now, this moment is celebrated, but it's also contested. Marconi heard something, but was it really the Poldhu signal? The receiver was crude. There was no way to record the signal or verify it independently. Atmospheric noise, static from lightning, even local electrical interference could produce clicks. Some historians and engineers have questioned whether what Marconi heard was genuinely the transmitted signal, or whether he heard what he desperately wanted to hear. The scientific establishment of the day was skeptical, but Marconi repeated the experiment in early 1902 with better equipment aboard the SS Philadelphia, sailing westward from England, and this time he was able to receive and record signals at distances up to about 2,500 kilometers. That was harder to argue with. But here's what's really fascinating. The signal worked, and nobody knew why. The waves were bending around the Earth, following the curvature, and there was no accepted explanation for how. It wasn't until 1902 that two scientists, Oliver Heaviside in England and Arthur Kennelly in the United States, working independently, proposed that there must be an electrically conductive layer high up in the atmosphere that was reflecting the radio waves back down to Earth. Imagine the signal shooting upward at an angle, hitting this invisible mirror in the sky, bouncing back down, maybe bouncing off the ocean surface, going back up, hitting the layer again, and skipping its way across the Atlantic like a stone across a pond. This hypothetical layer became known as the Kennelly-Heaviside layer, and it was eventually confirmed by direct experiment in 1924 by Edward Appleton, who won a Nobel Prize for it. We now call it the ionosphere, a region of the upper atmosphere, roughly 60 to 1,000 kilometers up, where solar radiation strips electrons from gas molecules, creating a plasma that can reflect certain radio frequencies. And this is beautiful, if you think about it. The ionosphere is essentially a gift from the sun. Solar energy creates this reflective shell around the planet, and that shell is what made long-distance radio communication possible. Without it, radio waves at those frequencies would just fly off into space. The entire early history of global wireless communication depended on a feature of the atmosphere that nobody even knew existed when Marconi made his gamble. He succeeded for reasons he didn't understand, using physics that hadn't been discovered yet. There's something wonderfully human about that. The willingness to try something that the experts say is impossible, and being right, even if you can't explain why you're right. The ionosphere, it turns out, is not a simple mirror. It's layered, it changes with the time of day, it changes with the seasons, and it's affected by solar activity, sunspots, solar flares, geomagnetic storms. During the day, the sun's radiation creates a lower layer called the D layer that actually absorbs certain frequencies rather than reflecting them. At night, that layer fades, and higher layers, the E and F layers, become the dominant reflectors, which is why AM radio stations can often be heard from much farther away at night than during the day. If you've ever been driving late at night and picked up an AM station from hundreds of miles away, a station you'd never hear during the daytime, that's the ionosphere doing its thing. The D layer has gone to sleep, and the signal is bouncing off the F layer and skipping across vast distances. This behavior, this dependence on time of day, season, solar activity, and frequency made early radio communication both magical and maddening. Operators would find that a frequency that worked perfectly at noon was useless at midnight, or that a link to South America was crystal clear for a week and then vanished for days during a solar storm. Understanding the ionosphere became one of the great scientific projects of the early 20th century, and it's still studied today because it still affects high-frequency radio communication, satellite signals, and GPS accuracy. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to the early 1900s because Marconi's transatlantic triumph, contested or not, changed everything. It proved, or at least strongly suggested, that wireless communication could span oceans. And that meant it wasn't just a convenience for coastal shipping. It was a potential replacement for the submarine telegraph cables that had been the backbone of global communication since the 1860s. Those cables were enormously expensive to manufacture and lay. They broke frequently. They were vulnerable to anchors and earthquakes and marine life, and they were controlled by a small number of powerful companies, mostly British. Wireless offered an alternative that didn't require physical infrastructure, stretching across the ocean floor. The geopolitical implications were enormous. Countries that didn't have access to the cable network, or that didn't trust the countries that controlled it, suddenly had a path to independent global communication. Marconi understood this, and he built his business around it. He established high-power transmitting stations around the world, in Ireland, in Nova Scotia, in Massachusetts, in Italy. He developed more powerful transmitters and more sensitive receivers. He fought patent battles on multiple continents. He built a commercial empire. And he also did something that was, in retrospect, both shrewd and controversial. He insisted that Marconi-equipped ships could only communicate with other Marconi-equipped ships and stations. This was a deliberate business strategy to lock customers into his system, and it worked commercially, but it had a dark side that would become tragically apparent. Because by 1910, wireless telegraphy had become common on passenger ships. Not universal, but common. The big liners, the ones carrying wealthy passengers across the Atlantic, had Marconi wireless rooms staffed by Marconi operators, and those operators were employees of the Marconi company, not the shipping line. Their primary job, believe it or not, was not safety communication. It was sending and receiving personal messages for passengers, telegrams, stock quotes, social correspondence. Safety messages, ice warnings, distress calls were handled, but they competed for attention with commercial traffic. There was no legal requirement for ships to maintain a continuous radio watch. There was no standardized distress frequency. There was no universal distress signal, though the letters CQD were commonly used, and a newer signal, 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots, SOS, had been proposed at an international conference in 1906, but wasn't yet universally adopted. And then, on the night of April 14, 1912, the RMS Titanic struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic, and everything about how the world thought about radio changed forever. The Titanic's 2 Marconi operators were Jack Phillips and Harold Bride. Phillips was the senior man, 25 years old, experienced and professional. Bride was younger, 22, serving as his assistant. They worked in a small cabin on the boat deck, and on the night of April 14th, they were busy, not with safety traffic, with passenger messages. The Titanic had been at sea for several days, and wealthy passengers had accumulated a backlog of personal telegrams they wanted sent. Phillips had been working through this pile for hours, and throughout that day, multiple ships in the area had sent ice warnings. The Californian, the Nordam, the Baltic, the America, message after message reporting ice in the path the Titanic was steaming through. Some of these warnings reached the bridge. Some didn't. At least one was acknowledged by the officers, but never plotted on the navigation chart. And then, at around 11 p.m., the Californian, which had actually stopped for the night because of the ice, tried to send another warning. Its operator, Cyril Evans, broke in on Phillips' frequency. And Phillips, frustrated because the Californian's signal was so strong it was drowning out the commercial traffic he was trying to relay through the Cape Race Station in Newfoundland, snapped back, shut up, I am busy." Evans, a lone operator with no one to relieve him, gave up and went to bed. About 30 minutes later, the Titanic hit the iceberg. Think about that sequence of events for a second. A safety warning was dismissed because it interfered with passenger telegrams. The ship sending the warning, the closest ship to the Titanic, close enough that its crew could actually see the Titanic's lights on the horizon, turned off its radio and went to sleep. And when the Titanic started sending distress calls, Phillips initially used CQD, then switched to SOS, one of the first major uses of that signal, the Californian never heard them. The ship that could have reached the Titanic in perhaps 20 minutes sat motionless all night, its radio silent, while over 1,500 people died in water just a few degrees above freezing. Other ships did hear the call. The Carpathia, about 58 miles away, picked up the distress signal because its operator, Harold Cottam, happened to still be awake. He was actually about to go to bed himself. He'd kept his headphones on a few extra minutes because he had a message for the Titanic about some prior traffic. If Cottam had gone to sleep 5 minutes earlier, the Carpathia might never have responded either. As it was, the Carpathia turned immediately, pushed through ice fields at maximum speed, faster than her captain thought the old ship could go, and arrived at the scene around 4 a.m. She rescued 710 survivors from the lifeboats. But by then, the Titanic had been at the bottom of the Atlantic for nearly 2 hours. The disaster was a turning point for radio, and I mean that in the most concrete legislative sense. The public outcry was enormous. People understood viscerally that wireless telegraphy could have saved lives, and that the way it was being used had actively contributed to the catastrophe. Within months, investigations were underway in both the United States and Britain, and the regulatory changes that followed reshaped the entire framework of maritime radio communication. The Radio Act of 1912, passed by the U.S. Congress just 4 months after the sinking, established several critical requirements. Ships carrying more than 50 passengers were required to have radio equipment and at least 2 operators, so that a continuous watch could be maintained. Distress calls were given absolute priority over all other traffic. No more telling an ice warning to shut up because you were busy with telegrams. An emergency frequency was designated. And here's something that mattered beyond just ships. The Act also required that all radio stations in the United States be licensed by the federal government. This was the first real assertion of government authority over the radio spectrum in America, and it established a principle that would shape everything that came after. That the airwaves were a public resource, subject to regulation, not a free-for-all that anyone could use however they pleased. Internationally, the London Safety of Life at Sea Conference in 1914 went further. It established requirements for lifeboat capacity, ice patrols. The International Ice Patrol still operates today, by the way, a direct legacy of the Titanic, and formalized international standards for maritime radio communication. SOS became the universally recognized distress signal. The era of treating shipboard radio as primarily a commercial convenience was over. Radio was now, officially and legally, a safety system first. But here's what's interesting about this period, and this is where the technology itself starts to change in really fundamental ways. Everything we've talked about so far, from Hertz's spark gap to Marconi's transatlantic signals, has been about spark transmitters. And spark transmitters, for all their historical importance, are actually pretty terrible radios. Here's why. When you create a spark, you're generating a burst of electromagnetic energy, but it's not a clean, single-frequency signal. It's a messy, broad splash of energy spread across a wide range of frequencies. Imagine the difference between striking a single piano key and slamming your forearm across the entire keyboard. A spark transmitter is the forearm. It works, in the sense that it produces radio waves that can be detected at a distance, but it's incredibly wasteful of spectrum space. One spark transmitter essentially monopolizes a huge chunk of the available frequencies, making it very difficult for multiple stations to operate in the same area without interfering with each other. What you really want, and engineers had known this for years, is a continuous wave. A clean, steady, single-frequency signal that you can then modulate, meaning you can vary it in a controlled way to carry information. Think of it like the difference between banging on a drum to send messages, which works, but it's crude, versus being able to sing a clear, sustained note that you can shape into words. The continuous wave is the sustained note. Now, there were a few paths to generating continuous waves, and they were all being explored in the early 1900s. One approach was the high-frequency alternator, essentially a very fast electrical generator that could produce alternating current at radio frequencies. Ernst Alexanderson, a Swedish-American engineer working for General Electric, developed the most successful version of this. His Alexanderson alternator was a remarkable piece of machinery, a spinning disc with hundreds of slots that could generate continuous waves at frequencies up to about 100 kilohertz. These were big, expensive, power-hungry machines. Some of them weighed tons, but they worked. Marconi actually used Alexanderson alternators in some of his high-power transatlantic stations. Reginald Fessenden, a Canadian inventor who deserves more credit than he typically gets, used an earlier version of this approach to make what's generally considered the first audio-radio broadcast on Christmas Eve, 1906. He transmitted voice and violin music from a station in Massachusetts to ships at sea. That's remarkable when you think about it. Just 8 years after people were debating whether radio waves could cross a room reliably, Fessenden was broadcasting music. But the real revolution, the thing that would make modern radio possible, came from a completely different direction. It came from a glass tube with most of the air pumped out of it. The vacuum tube. And the story of the vacuum tube is one of those beautiful, tangled histories where multiple people contributed essential pieces, and the question of who deserves credit depends entirely on which piece you think mattered most. It starts, in a way, with Thomas Edison. In 1883, Edison noticed something odd while working on his light bulbs. He found that if he put a metal plate inside a bulb, near the glowing filament but not touching it, a small electrical current would flow from the filament to the plate, but only in one direction. Current would flow when the plate was positive relative to the filament, but not when it was negative. Edison noted this, patented it, because Edison patented everything and then basically ignored it. He had no idea why it happened and no use for it. It became known as the Edison effect, and it sat there, a curiosity, for nearly 20 years. Then, in 1904, John Ambrose Fleming, a British physicist who had actually worked as a consultant for both Edison and Marconi, realized that this one-way current flow could be incredibly useful for radio. See, one of the big problems with receiving radio signals was detecting them, converting the high-frequency oscillations of the radio wave into something you could actually hear in a pair of headphones. The coherer that Marconi used was unreliable and slow. What Fleming realized was that the Edison effect could be used as a detector. He built a tube with two elements, a heated filament and a metal plate, and showed that it could convert alternating radio frequency signals into direct current. It was a rectifier, a one-way valve for electrical current. Fleming called it an oscillation valve. Americans would later call it a diode, and it worked beautifully as a radio detector. But here's where the story gets really interesting, because Fleming's valve, as clever as it was, could only detect signals. It couldn't amplify them. And amplification, making a weak signal stronger, was the holy grail. Think about what that means practically. Radio signals, by the time they've traveled hundreds or thousands of miles, are incredibly faint. Barely a whisper of electromagnetic energy arriving at your antenna. If you could take that whisper and make it louder, amplify it, you could receive signals from much farther away, and eventually, you could do things with radio that were simply impossible with unamplified signals. The person who figured out how to do this was an American inventor named Lee DeForest, and he is one of the most complicated, controversial figures in the history of technology. DeForest was brilliant, self-promoting, frequently dishonest, repeatedly sued, and genuinely responsible for one of the most important inventions of the 20th century. In 1906, he added a third element to Fleming's valve, a small grid of wire placed between the filament and the plate. He called the resulting device the audion, and what he discovered, though it took him years to fully understand why it worked, was that a small voltage applied to this grid could control a much larger current flowing between the filament and the plate. A tiny signal on the grid produced a big change in the plate current. In other words, it amplified. This is genuinely one of those moments where the world pivots. The triode vacuum tube, the audion, refined and understood by other engineers, particularly Edwin Howard Armstrong and Irving Langmuir, became the foundation of all electronic technology for the next 50 years. It could amplify signals. It could generate continuous waves. It could oscillate, meaning it could produce the clean, steady radio frequencies that spark transmitters never could. And it could do all of this in a device that fit in your hand, that required relatively modest power, that could be manufactured in quantity. The vacuum tube made radio broadcasting possible. It made long-distance telephone calls possible. It made radar possible. Eventually, it made the first computers possible. Everything electronic, from about 1910 to the late 1950s, ran on vacuum tubes, and the person who really unlocked the tube's potential, who figured out the circuit that made it truly revolutionary, was a young engineering student at Columbia University named Edwin Howard Armstrong. Armstrong is one of those figures in engineering history who you just can't help but feel for, because his story is one of extraordinary brilliance paired with extraordinary tragedy. In 1912, when he was just 21 years old, Armstrong figured out something that DeForest had never understood about his own invention. Armstrong discovered that if you took the output of a triode and fed a portion of it back into the input, a technique called regeneration or positive feedback, you could amplify a signal thousands of times over instead of just a few times. You could also push the tube into oscillation, making it generate continuous waves. This single insight, regeneration, turned the vacuum tube from a modest improvement over existing detectors into a powerhouse. Think about what that means in practical terms. Before regeneration, you might pick up a faint whisper of a signal from across the ocean, barely distinguishable from the static. After regeneration, that same whisper could be amplified into something clear, something usable. Armstrong had essentially discovered electronic gain, real, controllable, enormous gain. And he'd done it as an undergraduate, working in the basement of Philosophy Hall at Columbia, late at night, with borrowed equipment and a dogged refusal to stop tinkering until he understood exactly what was happening inside that little glass tube. And here's where the story gets complicated, because Armstrong's regeneration circuit, which he demonstrated to witnesses in 1913 and filed a patent for in October of that year, became the subject of one of the longest, most bitter patent disputes in American history. Lee DeForest, who had invented the audion in the first place but had never fully understood why it worked, eventually claimed that he had discovered regeneration first. DeForest filed his own patent application in 1914, and what followed was a legal battle that dragged on for over 20 years. 20 years. Think about that. 2 decades of courtrooms, depositions, appeals, and reversals, all over the question of who first figured out how to feed a signal back into a vacuum tube. The technical community overwhelmingly sided with Armstrong. The Institute of Radio Engineers awarded him their Medal of Honor in 1917 for his work on regeneration. His notebooks, his witnesses, his demonstrations. The evidence was strong. But the courts are not engineering laboratories, and legal arguments don't always track with technical reality. DeForest's lawyers were able to construct a narrative based on some of DeForest's earlier experiments that muddied the waters just enough. The case went back and forth. Armstrong won, then DeForest won on appeal, then it went to the Supreme Court in 1934, and the Supreme Court sided with DeForest. The engineering community was stunned. Armstrong tried to return his Medal of Honor to the Institute of Radio Engineers in protest, and they refused to accept it, which tells you everything about where the technical consensus stood. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's come back to what regeneration actually made possible, because the timing matters. Armstrong's discovery came right on the eve of World War I, and the war changed everything about radio. Before the war, radio was primarily a maritime and point-to-point communication technology. Marconi's company dominated commercial wireless telegraphy. Amateurs tinkered. The military was interested, but hadn't fully committed. The war forced the issue. Suddenly, the ability to communicate without wires wasn't a convenience. It was a matter of life and death. Armies needed to coordinate across trenches and battlefields. Navies needed to direct fleets. Aircraft, still fragile and new, needed some way to report what they saw from the air. The U.S. government did something remarkable when America entered the war in 1917. It essentially suspended all private radio patents and pooled them. The Navy took control of all radio stations in the country. For the duration of the war, the patent fights didn't matter. Engineers from competing companies worked side by side, and the technology advanced rapidly. Vacuum tubes were manufactured by the thousands, then the tens of thousands. Transmitters got more powerful and more reliable. Receivers got more sensitive. And Armstrong, now a captain in the Army Signal Corps stationed in Paris, made his second major invention. He was trying to solve a very specific problem. The Germans were using radio frequencies above 1 megahertz, what we'd call shortwave today, and the Allied forces needed to detect those transmissions. But the existing receivers couldn't handle those higher frequencies well. Regenerative circuits worked, but they became finicky and hard to control at higher frequencies. Armstrong's solution was breathtakingly elegant. He called it the super-heterodyne receiver, and it's worth spending a moment on because this invention is still the basis of virtually every radio receiver you've ever used. Your car radio, your phone's cellular receiver, your Wi-Fi chip. They all use the super-heterodyne principle that Armstrong worked out in a cramped lab in Paris in 1918. Here's the idea. Instead of trying to amplify and process a signal at whatever frequency it happens to arrive on, which might be very high and hard to work with, you first convert it to a lower, fixed frequency called the intermediate frequency, or IF. You do this by mixing the incoming signal with a locally generated signal from an oscillator inside the receiver. When you combine two frequencies, you get sum and difference frequencies. The difference frequency is your intermediate frequency, and it's always the same no matter what station you're tuned to. Then, you amplify and filter at that intermediate frequency, where everything is much easier to control. Think of it this way. Imagine you're trying to catch different sizes of fish in a river, and you only have one perfect net that works great for medium-sized fish. Instead of building a different net for every size of fish, you figure out a way to magically resize all the fish to medium before they hit your net. That's essentially what the superheterodyne does. It translates every incoming signal to the same intermediate frequency where your amplifier and filter work best. You tune to different stations not by changing the amplifier, but by changing the frequency of that local oscillator. It's clever. It's really, really clever. Armstrong patented the superheterodyne in 1918, and after the war, he sold the rights to Westinghouse, which helped fund his continued research. And now we need to talk about what happened after the war, because this is when radio transformed from a communication tool into a mass medium, when broadcasting was born. The story of how broadcasting started is one of those things that seems inevitable in retrospect, but was actually quite surprising at the time. The whole model of radio up to this point was one-to-one communication, or at most, one to several. A ship talks to a shore station. An army headquarters talks to a field unit. The idea that you would just transmit into the air for anyone to hear, music, news, entertainment, and that millions of people would buy receivers just to listen, that was not obvious. In fact, many serious radio engineers thought it was a frivolous waste of spectrum, but a few people saw the potential. One of them was David Sarnoff, a Russian immigrant who had worked as a telegraph operator for the Marconi company. He was actually one of the operators who picked up distress signals during the Titanic disaster, though his later claims about being the sole relay point were considerably exaggerated. Sarnoff had written a memo as early as 1916 proposing what he called a radio music box, a simple receiver that could be sold to households for entertainment. His bosses at Marconi weren't interested. But after the war, when the U.S. government pressured the formation of the Radio Corporation of America, RCA, by pooling patents from General Electric, Westinghouse, AT&T, and the American Marconi Company, Sarnoff rose through the ranks and eventually got his chance. The conventional story says that KDKA in Pittsburgh, operated by Westinghouse, was the first commercial radio station, launching with its broadcast of the Harding-Cox presidential election results on November 2, 1920. The reality is a bit messier. Several other stations have legitimate claims to being first, including 8MK in Detroit, which had been broadcasting since August of that year, and a station run by Charles Herald in San Jose that had been doing regular broadcasts as early as 1912. But KDKA had the corporate backing and the publicity machine, and it became the symbol of the broadcasting era. What happened next was explosive. In 1920, there were essentially no commercial radio stations in the United States. By 1922, there were over 500. Receiver sales went from almost nothing to $60 million a year. People were building crystal sets at home from kits, winding their own coils, poking at galena crystals with thin wire whiskers to find the sweet spot that made the detector work. Radio clubs formed in every city. Families gathered around receivers in their living rooms, the way they'd later gather around televisions. It was a genuine cultural revolution, and it happened with astonishing speed. But here's the thing. All this explosive growth created a massive technical problem, and it's a problem that goes right back to the physics we talked about earlier. When you have hundreds of stations all broadcasting at once, and they're all using similar frequencies, they interfere with each other. Remember how we talked about spark transmitters spraying energy across a wide band of frequencies? Well, even with continuous wave transmitters and vacuum tubes, the early broadcasting equipment wasn't particularly precise. stations drifted off their assigned frequencies. Receivers weren't very selective. They couldn't easily distinguish between two stations that were close together on the dial. The result was chaos. Stations talked over each other. Powerful stations drowned out weaker ones. There was no effective regulation because the Radio Act of 1912 had been written for maritime telegraphy and simply wasn't equipped to handle broadcasting. The government tried to manage things through a series of national radio conferences organized by Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover between 1922 and 1925. But Hoover's authority was limited, and a 1926 court ruling essentially said the Commerce Department had no power to deny radio licenses or enforce frequency assignments under the existing law. The result was a free-for-all. Stations jumped to whatever frequency they wanted. Some cranked up their power to drown out competitors. The airwaves became nearly unusable in some areas. This crisis led directly to the Radio Act of 1927 and the creation of the Federal Radio Commission, which was given real authority to assign frequencies, set power limits, and revoke licenses. The principle established was that the electromagnetic spectrum belonged to the public, and broadcasters were using it under license, a principle that carried over into the Communications Act of 1934, which created the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, which still regulates American radio and television and telecommunications today. It's worth pausing on that idea because it's genuinely profound. The radio spectrum is a natural resource, like water or air, and the decision to treat it as a public trust rather than private property shaped the entire development of electronic communication in the 20th century. Now, while all of this regulatory drama was playing out, the technology kept advancing. And this brings us back to Edwin Howard Armstrong, because he was about to make his third, and arguably greatest, invention. By the late 1920s, Armstrong was wealthy from his earlier patents, married, and a professor at Columbia. He was also deeply frustrated by a problem that had plagued radio since its earliest days: static, atmospheric noise, electrical interference, the crackle and hiss that made AM radio, amplitude modulation, sound like it was being transmitted through a thunderstorm, which, in a sense, it was. Lightning, electrical motors, car ignitions, even the random thermal noise in the atmosphere, all of these created amplitude disturbances that an AM receiver couldn't distinguish from the signal itself, because AM encodes information in the strength of the wave, and noise also affects the strength of the wave. Armstrong's solution was frequency modulation, FM. Instead of varying the amplitude of the carrier wave to encode sound, you keep the amplitude constant and vary the frequency. You wiggle the wave back and forth slightly faster or slower to carry the audio information. And here's what's beautiful about this. Most natural and man-made noise affects amplitude, not frequency. So an FM receiver can be designed to ignore amplitude variations entirely. It just strips them away. What you're left with is a signal that's remarkably clean, remarkably quiet, with a fidelity that made AM sound like tin cans and string by comparison. Armstrong demonstrated FM to RCA and to David Sarnoff in 1933. He set up a transmitter at the top of the Empire State Building and showed that FM could deliver crystal clear audio with virtually no static. It was a technical triumph. And Sarnoff, who had been Armstrong's friend for years, who had encouraged the research, looked at what Armstrong had built and saw a threat. Because RCA had just invested enormous sums in building the AM broadcasting infrastructure. They were also pivoting toward television, and they wanted to use the very frequencies that FM would need. Supporting FM would mean undermining their own AM network and potentially delaying television. So Sarnoff turned against Armstrong. RCA withdrew its support. They lobbied the FCC to limit FM's spectrum allocation and power. When the FCC did finally authorize FM broadcasting, they later moved FM to a completely different frequency band in 1945, from around 42 to 50 megahertz, up to 88 to 108 megahertz, where it sits today, which rendered every existing FM transmitter and receiver in the country obsolete overnight. The official reason was to reduce interference from atmospheric skip propagation, and there was some technical merit to that argument. But Armstrong and many others believed RCA's lobbying was the real driving force. Armstrong spent the late 1940s and early 1950s fighting RCA in court over FM patents, pouring his fortune into legal fees, watching the technology he'd invented being used by companies that refused to pay him royalties. His marriage suffered. His finances collapsed. On January 31st, 1954, Edwin Howard Armstrong put on his overcoat, his scarf, and his gloves, removed the air conditioner from the window of his 13th floor apartment in New York City, and stepped out into the night. He was 63 years old, the man who had given the world regeneration, the superheterodyne receiver, and FM radio, three inventions that are still fundamental to every wireless device on the planet, died alone on a winter sidewalk, broken by legal battles against corporations that had profited enormously from his genius. His wife, Marion, took up the patent fights after his death. She won every single one of them. Every major manufacturer eventually settled or lost in court. The patents were valid. Armstrong had been right. But he wasn't there to see it. It's a hard story to sit with, and I think it matters because it shows you something important about how technology actually develops. It's not just physics and engineering. It's money. It's politics. It's ego. It's corporate strategy. It's legal maneuvering. The best technology doesn't always win on its own merits. Sometimes it needs decades and enormous human cost before the world catches up to what one person saw clearly. And FM did eventually triumph, of course. Today, FM radio delivers music and talk with a clarity that Armstrong would have been proud of on the exact principles he laid out in the 1930s. Every time you tune to an FM station and hear that clean, quiet signal, no hiss, no crackle, just sound, that's Armstrong's gift. But there's another dimension to frequency modulation that goes beyond broadcasting, and it connects to something we haven't talked about yet. The way information itself can be encoded in radio waves, and how the choice between AM and FM is really a choice about how you use bandwidth, how you trade spectrum space for signal quality, and how that trade-off sits at the heart of everything modern communications has become. So let's talk about it, because once you see this clearly, a lot of things about the modern radio landscape start to make intuitive sense. Think about AM for a second. When you transmit an AM signal, you're varying the strength, the amplitude of your carrier wave to match the shape of the audio you want to send. The carrier itself might be at, say, 880 kilohertz, and it stays right there at 880 kilohertz the whole time. What changes is how tall the wave is, moment to moment. The pattern of those height changes is your audio. Now, the bandwidth that signal occupies, the slice of spectrum it takes up, is relatively narrow. A typical AM broadcast channel is about 10 kilohertz wide. That's it. 10,000 hertz of spectrum space to carry your entire audio signal. And that's part of why AM sounds the way it does, a little thin, a little muffled. You're squeezing audio into a narrow pipe, and the high frequencies in music and voice, the ones that give sound its sparkle and detail, they get clipped off because there just isn't room for them in that 10 kilohertz channel. FM does something fundamentally different. Instead of changing the height of the wave, you're changing how fast it oscillates, the frequency. When the audio signal goes up, the carrier frequency shifts a little higher. When the audio dips down, the carrier shifts lower. The amplitude stays constant the whole time, which is why electrical noise, which mostly affects amplitude, doesn't corrupt your signal. But here's the cost. To encode audio this way with high fidelity, you need the carrier to swing back and forth across a much wider range of frequencies. A standard FM broadcast channel is 200 kilohertz wide. That's 20 times wider than an AM channel. You're using 20 times as much spectrum to carry one station's worth of audio. And that right there is the fundamental trade-off. FM gives you better sound quality and noise immunity, but it's expensive in terms of spectrum. AM is spectrally efficient, but vulnerable to interference. It's not that one is simply better than the other. They represent different engineering choices about how to spend a limited resource, and spectrum is very much a limited resource. There's only so much electromagnetic real estate between, say, 88 and 108 megahertz, which is where FM broadcasting lives. At 200 kilohertz per channel, you can fit about 100 stations in that band. If each station only needed 10 kilohertz like AM, you could fit 2,000. Now, this idea that there's a deep relationship between bandwidth and the quality or quantity of information you can transmit, this was floating around as intuition among radio engineers for decades. People like Armstrong understood it in their bones. But it wasn't formalized as mathematics until 1948, when a quiet, brilliant mathematician at Bell Labs named Claude Shannon published a paper called A Mathematical Theory of Communication. And honestly, if you had to pick one paper that shaped the entire modern world of digital communications, that's the one. Shannon was a fascinating character. He'd grown up in a small town in Michigan, Gaylord, tinkering with telegraph equipment and building gadgets. He went to the University of Michigan, then to MIT, where his master's thesis, not even his doctoral work, proved that Boolean algebra could be used to design electrical switching circuits. That single insight is basically the theoretical foundation of all digital computing. He was 21 years old. By the time he got to Bell Labs, he was already recognized as someone operating on a different level. He juggled in the hallways, rode a unicycle through the corridors, and spent his time thinking about the deepest possible questions about information itself. What Shannon did in that 1948 paper was define information mathematically. He stripped away all the human meaning. He didn't care whether you were transmitting Shakespeare or stock prices or random noise. He asked, what is the maximum rate at which information can be reliably transmitted through a channel that has a certain bandwidth and a certain amount of noise? And he proved, rigorously, mathematically, that there is a hard upper limit. It's now called the Shannon limit, or channel capacity, and the formula is surprisingly elegant. The capacity of a channel, in bits per second, equals the bandwidth multiplied by the logarithm of 1 plus the signal-to-noise ratio. More bandwidth, more capacity. Better signal-to-noise ratio, more capacity. But there's always a ceiling, and no amount of clever engineering can exceed it. You can get close, but you can never go past it. Here's what's really profound about this. Shannon didn't just say there's a limit. He proved that you can actually get arbitrarily close to that limit with vanishingly small error rates, as long as you use the right encoding scheme. He didn't tell you exactly what that encoding scheme was in every case, but he proved it existed. That's the kind of result that changes an entire field overnight. Before Shannon, engineers designed communication systems by intuition and trial and error. After Shannon, they had a target. They knew exactly how good their system could theoretically be, and they could measure how close they were getting. And think about what this means for the AM versus FM discussion. Shannon's framework tells you that when FM uses 20 times the bandwidth of AM, it's not wasting spectrum. It's spending spectrum to buy signal quality. The wider bandwidth allows you to spread the information out, which makes it more resistant to noise. It's the same principle that shows up everywhere in modern communications. Spread spectrum techniques, which we'll get to, do exactly this. They deliberately use more bandwidth than strictly necessary because the noise immunity is worth it. But let's come back to the practical world of radio for a moment, because while Shannon was working out the mathematics of information in the late 1940s, the radio landscape itself was undergoing another massive transformation. Television was arriving, and it was hungry. Hungry for spectrum, hungry for engineering talent, hungry for money. And television, when you think about it, is really just radio with an enormous appetite. A television signal in the analog era needed about 6 megahertz of bandwidth per channel. 6 million hertz. Compare that to AM radio's 10 kilohertz or FM's 200 kilohertz. Television was a spectrum hog because it had to be. You're transmitting not just audio, but a full moving image, tens of thousands of pixels refreshed 30 times per second. That's an enormous amount of information, and Shannon's law tells you that enormous information requires either enormous bandwidth or an impossibly clean signal, or both. So television ate up huge chunks of the VHF and UHF bands, and the FCC had to carefully allocate channels across the country, making sure stations in nearby cities didn't interfere with each other. This is where frequency allocation becomes almost like urban planning. The FCC, and its equivalents in other countries, and eventually the International Telecommunication Union coordinating globally, had to divide up the spectrum the way a city divides up land into zones. This slice is for AM broadcasting. This slice is for FM. This wide swath is for television. This narrow band is for aviation. This one is for maritime. This one is for amateur radio operators. This one is for the military. And the boundaries matter enormously, because if two services overlap or sit too close together without adequate guard bands between them, they interfere with each other and nobody gets a clean signal. The whole system rests on that basic physical reality we talked about early on, that electromagnetic waves at different frequencies coexist in the same space without interacting, as long as your receiver can select just the frequency you want. That's what Armstrong's superheterodyne receiver made possible with such precision. And the entire architecture of modern spectrum management is built on the assumption that we can slice the spectrum finely enough and build receivers selective enough to keep all these services from stepping on each other. But there's a problem with this approach, and by the mid-20th century, engineers were starting to feel it acutely. The spectrum was getting crowded. Every new service, television, radar, microwave relay, links, mobile radio for police and taxis and businesses, every new application needed its own dedicated slice of spectrum, and the slices were running out. Or rather, the convenient slices were running out. There's plenty of spectrum up in the microwave range, tens of gigahertz and beyond, but those frequencies behave differently. They don't bend around hills. They get absorbed by rain. They need line of sight between transmitter and receiver. So the sweet spot, roughly from a few hundred kilohertz up to a few gigahertz, was becoming precious real estate, and everyone wanted a piece. This pressure to use spectrum more efficiently drove some of the most important innovations in radio engineering from the 1950s onward. And one of the most consequential ideas came from an actress. Well, an actress and a composer, to be precise. Hedy Lamarr, yes, the Hollywood star, and George Antheil, an avant-garde musician, had patented a concept during World War II called frequency hopping. The original idea was for torpedo guidance. The problem was that radio-controlled torpedoes could be jammed. The enemy could broadcast noise on the control frequency and make the torpedo go haywire. Lamarr and Antheil's solution was to have both the transmitter and the torpedo's receiver hop between frequencies in a synchronized pattern. If you're only on any given frequency for a fraction of a second before jumping to another one, a jammer can't keep up. The Navy didn't use their patent during the war. The technology to implement it reliably didn't quite exist yet. But the concept was visionary. Frequency hopping is one form of what's called spread spectrum communication, and here's where it connects back to Shannon. Instead of camping on one narrow frequency channel, you spread your signal across a wide band of frequencies. You're using more total bandwidth, but you're using each individual frequency only briefly or lightly. The result is a signal that's incredibly hard to jam, hard to intercept, and, here's the really clever part, you can have multiple users sharing the same wide band simultaneously, each hopping in a different pattern, and they barely interfere with each other. It's like having a conversation in a crowded room by constantly switching which language you're speaking. Anyone trying to eavesdrop on just one language hears only brief fragments. The military developed spread spectrum extensively through the Cold War, and it remained classified technology for decades. But when it was finally declassified and made available for commercial use in the 1980s and 1990s, it became the foundation of something you use every single day. Your Wi-Fi connection uses spread spectrum techniques. Your Bluetooth headphones use frequency hopping. Literally, the Lamarr and Antheil concept, refined and miniaturized into a tiny chip. And the CDMA standard that powered millions of cell phones through the 2000s, code division multiple access, is spread spectrum at its core. And this is where the story of radio starts to merge with the story of computing and digital communications. Because once you start thinking about radio signals as carriers of digital data, ones and zeros rather than continuous audio waves, everything changes. The encoding schemes get more sophisticated. The modulation techniques multiply. Instead of just AM and FM, you get phase shift keying, quadrature amplitude modulation, orthogonal frequency division multiplexing. These names sound intimidating, but they're all just different answers to the same question Shannon posed. How do you pack the most information into a given amount of spectrum with an acceptable error rate? Take your cell phone. When you make a call or load a web page, your phone is transmitting and receiving digital data on radio waves, using modulation techniques that would have seemed like science fiction to Marconi or even to Armstrong. A modern 5G signal uses something called OFDM, orthogonal frequency division multiplexing, which splits a wide channel into thousands of narrow subcarriers, each carrying a small piece of the data simultaneously. It's like having thousands of tiny AM or FM stations all operating in parallel within a single channel, carefully arranged so they don't interfere with each other. The math behind it relies on the fast Fourier transform, which itself relies on principles that go all the way back to Joseph Fourier's work on heat, conduction in the early 1800s. The threads connecting these ideas span centuries, and the amount of data we push through radio waves now is staggering. A single 5G cell can deliver gigabits per second, billions of ones and zeros every second, riding on electromagnetic waves that are fundamentally the same phenomenon Hertz detected with his little spark gap and loop of wire in that Karlsruhe laboratory in 1887. The physics hasn't changed. Maxwell's equations are exactly the same. What's changed is our understanding of how to encode, transmit, and decode information within those waves, and the silicon technology that lets us do the signal processing fast enough to keep up. Which brings us to something that's easy to overlook, but absolutely essential to how radio works in the modern world: the antenna. We've talked a lot about transmitters and receivers and modulation schemes, but the antenna is where the rubber meets the road, where electrical current becomes electromagnetic radiation, and vice versa. And the engineering of antennas has its own fascinating history, full of trial and error, clever physics, and some genuinely beautiful engineering. So let's talk about antennas for a while, because once you understand how they work, you start seeing them everywhere, and you start appreciating just how much invisible thought has gone into something most people never think about twice. The basic idea is deceptively simple. An antenna is a conductor, usually metal, shaped and sized so that when alternating current flows through it, it radiates electromagnetic energy efficiently. Or, working in reverse, when electromagnetic waves wash over it, they induce a tiny alternating current that a receiver can amplify and decode. That's it. That's the fundamental job. But the details of how you shape that conductor, how long you make it, where you place it, how you orient it, that's where the art and science come in. The simplest antenna you can imagine is just a straight piece of wire, and in the very early days of radio, that's more or less what people used. Marconi's early antennas were long wires strung up on poles or kites, and they worked, but not because anyone had a deep theoretical understanding of why. The real theory of antennas didn't start coming together until the early 20th century, and the key insight is one of those things that sounds obvious once you hear it, but took real genius to formalize. The most efficient radiation happens when the length of the antenna is related to the wavelength of the signal you're trying to transmit or receive. Specifically, a half-wave dipole, a straight conductor whose total length is about half the wavelength of the target frequency, is one of the most fundamental and efficient antenna designs there is. Think about what that means practically. If you're transmitting at, say, 100 megahertz, right in the middle of the FM radio band, the wavelength is about 3 meters, so a half-wave dipole for FM would be about 1.5 meters long, which is totally manageable. You could mount that on a rooftop, no problem. But go down to AM broadcast frequencies, say 1 megahertz, and the wavelength is 300 meters. A half-wave dipole would be 150 meters long. That's nearly 500 feet of wire. You can't exactly stick that on your car. That's why AM radio stations use enormous tower antennas, those tall structures you sometimes see alongside highways, often with blinking red lights on top. Those towers aren't just holding up an antenna. In many cases, the tower itself is the antenna. The whole steel structure is energized and radiating, and they're typically about a quarter wavelength tall, using the ground beneath them as a mirror of sorts, an electrical mirror, to effectively create the missing other half of the dipole. It's a trick called a ground plane antenna, and it works remarkably well. Now here's where it gets really interesting. As radio technology pushed to higher and higher frequencies over the decades, From the long waves and medium waves of early broadcasting, up through shortwave, VHF, UHF, and eventually into the microwave bands, the antennas got smaller, much smaller, because the wavelength shrinks as the frequency goes up. At 2.4 gigahertz, which is the frequency your Wi-Fi router uses, the wavelength is only about 12 centimeters, less than 5 inches. A half-wave dipole at that frequency is tiny. That's why the antennas on your router are those little stubby things, and why the antenna inside your phone can be a strip of metal just a few centimeters long hidden behind the case. The physics is exactly the same as Marconi's towering wire antennas. It's just scaled down because the frequencies are so much higher. But simple dipoles and quarter-wave verticals are just the beginning. One of the great leaps in antenna engineering came with the development of directional antennas, designs that don't radiate equally in all directions, but instead focus energy in a particular direction, like a flashlight focuses light compared to a bare bulb. The most familiar example is probably the Yagi-Uda antenna, which you've almost certainly seen even if you didn't know its name. It's the classic TV antenna, that long horizontal boom with a series of parallel metal rods of different lengths arranged along it. You'd see them on rooftops all across America and Europe from the 1950s through the 1990s, before cable and satellite and streaming made them less common, though they're actually making a comeback now with over-the-air digital television. The Yagi-Uda antenna was invented in the late 1920s by two Japanese engineers, Shintaro Uda and Hidetsugu Yagi, at Tohoku Imperial University. Uda did most of the original research, but Yagi published the work in English and presented it internationally, so for decades it was known simply as the Yagi antenna, which was a bit unfair to Uda, and the dual name is now more commonly used. The design is genuinely clever. Only one of those metal rods, called the driven element, is actually connected to the transmission line going to your TV. The other rods are what are called parasitic elements. Some are slightly longer than the driven element and act as reflectors, bouncing energy forward. Others are slightly shorter and act as directors, pulling the radiation pattern in a specific direction. The result is an antenna with significant gain. It can pick up signals from one direction much more effectively than a simple dipole could. And all of this happens purely through the physics of electromagnetic coupling between the elements. There's no active electronics involved, no amplifiers, nothing powered. Just carefully sized pieces of metal arranged at specific spacings. The electromagnetic waves do all the work. The irony of the Yagi-Uda antenna's history is a bit painful. During World War II, the Japanese military largely overlooked Yagi's work, but the Allies didn't. British and American radar engineers adopted Yagi-Uda designs extensively for their radar systems, particularly for airborne radar, where the antenna needed to be compact and directional. When Japanese forces captured Allied radar equipment in Singapore in 1942, they found documents referencing Yagi antennas and reportedly had to ask, "Who is Yagi?" Their own countryman's invention had been developed and deployed more effectively by the other side. It's one of those stories that says something important about how innovation works. It's not enough to invent something. You have to recognize its value, develop it, and put it to use. Now, as frequencies climbed even higher, into the microwave bands, above a few gigahertz, antenna design took yet another turn. At those frequencies, you can start treating radio waves almost like light, because the wavelengths are so short, centimeters or even millimeters, and that opens up the possibility of using reflectors, just like optical telescopes use mirrors. The parabolic dish antenna is the most iconic example. You've seen satellite dishes, of course, and radio telescopes, those enormous bowl-shaped structures. The principle is the same as a flashlight reflector, just running in reverse. A parabolic curve has the geometric property that all incoming parallel rays, whether they're light rays or radio waves, reflect off the curved surface and converge at a single point, called the focus. Put a small antenna element at the focus, and you've got an incredibly sensitive, highly directional receiver. Or run it backward. Put a transmitter at the focus, and the dish projects a tight beam of radio energy outward. The gain of a parabolic dish antenna is proportional to the area of the dish and inversely proportional to the square of the wavelength. So the bigger the dish and the shorter the wavelength, the more focused and powerful the beam. This is why deep space communication uses enormous dishes operating at microwave frequencies. NASA's Deep Space Network uses 70-meter dishes over 200 feet across to communicate with spacecraft billions of miles away. The Voyager probes, launched in 1977, are now in interstellar space, over 15 billion miles from Earth, and we can still talk to them. The signal that reaches Earth from Voyager is absurdly faint. About 20 watts of transmit power, arriving at Earth with a strength of roughly 10 to the minus 16 watts. That's a decimal point followed by 15 zeros, and then a 1, 100 quadrillionth of a watt. And we can still detect it, decode it, and extract scientific data from it. That's the power of a well-designed antenna system combined with sensitive receivers and clever signal processing. But let's come back down to Earth, literally, because the antenna story that probably affects your daily life most directly is the one happening inside your smartphone. Modern phones have to communicate across multiple frequency bands simultaneously. Cellular voice and data on various bands from around 600 megahertz up to several gigahertz, Wi-Fi at 2.4 and 5 gigahertz, Bluetooth at 2.4 gigahertz, GPS at about 1.5 gigahertz, and with 5G millimeter wave, frequencies up around 28 or 39 gigahertz. Each of these needs an antenna, and they all have to fit inside a device that's a few millimeters thin and mostly made of glass and metal. The antenna engineers who design these systems are solving one of the most constrained optimization problems in all of engineering. They use techniques that would astonish the early radio pioneers. Antennas printed directly onto circuit boards. Slot antennas cut into the metal frame of the phone itself. Phased arrays, groups of tiny antenna elements that work together, their signals combined with precise timing to steer beams electronically without any physical movement. That last one, phased arrays, is worth lingering on for a moment because it's one of the most important antenna technologies of the modern era, and it has a history that winds through military radar, space exploration, and now into the phone in your pocket. The idea behind a phased array is this. Instead of one big antenna, you use many small antennas arranged in a grid. By carefully controlling the timing, the phase, of the signal fed to each element, you can make the combined radiation pattern point in any direction you want. Tilt the phase a little across the array, and the beam tilts. Change the phasing pattern, and you can reshape the beam, make it wider or narrower, even create multiple beams pointing in different directions simultaneously, all electronically in microseconds, with no moving parts. The military developed phased array radar systems starting in the 1950s and 1960s. One of the most famous is the AN/FPS-85, a massive phased array radar built in 1969 at Edwin Air Force Base in Florida for tracking objects in space, satellites, missiles, orbital debris. Its transmitting array has over 5,000 individual antenna elements spread across a building-sized face. It can track hundreds of objects simultaneously, switching its beam from one target to another in milliseconds. Before phased arrays, a radar had to physically rotate its antenna to scan the sky, which meant it could only look in one direction at a time and took seconds to complete a sweep. Phased arrays changed everything. They could look everywhere, almost at once. And now that same fundamental technology has been miniaturized to the point where it fits inside a 5G phone. The millimeter wave 5G bands, operating at frequencies around 28 gigahertz, use wavelengths of about 10 millimeters. At that scale, you can fit an array of antenna elements, maybe 8 or 16 of them, into a module smaller than a postage stamp. Your phone uses these tiny phased arrays to steer its beam toward the nearest cell tower, tracking it as you move, adjusting in real time. Its military radar technology from the Cold War era, shrunk down and mass-produced for a consumer device that costs a few $100s. Think about that for a second. And this connects to something broader about how radio technology has evolved, a pattern we've seen again and again throughout this whole story. Ideas that start as theoretical insights get turned into crude practical systems. Those systems get refined over decades. They migrate from military or specialized applications into commercial ones, and eventually they become so ubiquitous that nobody even thinks about them anymore. Maxwell's equations to Hertz's spark gap to Marconi's telegraph to Armstrong's FM to Shannon's information theory to spread spectrum to OFDM to phased arrays in your pocket. Each step built on everything that came before. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was irrelevant. And there's one more piece of this modern radio puzzle that ties everything together. Something that's been quietly revolutionizing how we build radios for the last few decades. It's called software-defined radio, and the idea behind it is almost radical in its simplicity. Instead of building a different radio for every frequency, every modulation scheme, every protocol, instead of designing one piece of hardware for FM, and another for Wi-Fi, and another for Bluetooth, and another for GPS, what if you built one radio that could become any radio just by changing the software running on it? That's the core insight. You take in the raw radio signal with an antenna and a very broadband front end. You digitize it as early in the chain as possible, convert those electromagnetic waves into numbers, and then you do everything else in software: filtering, demodulation, decoding, error correction, all of it. Just math running on a processor. And here's why that matters so much. For most of radio's history, if you wanted to receive a new kind of signal, you needed new hardware, new filters tuned to the right frequencies, new demodulator circuits matched to the modulation scheme, new everything. It's like needing a completely different television set for every channel. Software-defined radio flips that on its head. The hardware stays the same. You just load different software, and suddenly your radio understands a completely different protocol. It can listen to FM broadcasts one moment, decode digital aircraft transponder signals the next, pick up weather satellite imagery after that, and then switch to receiving amateur radio digital modes, all without changing a single physical component. The concept had been floating around in military circles since at least the 1970s and 1980s. The US military had a very practical problem. They had accumulated so many different radio systems across the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines that units from different branches literally couldn't talk to each other. Different frequencies, different modulation schemes, different encryption standards. It was a mess, and it had real consequences. During the invasion of Grenada in 1983, the story goes that an Army officer on the ground couldn't reach Navy ships offshore using his radio and had to use a civilian telephone to call back to the United States to request naval gunfire support. Whether every detail of that particular anecdote is perfectly accurate, the underlying problem was absolutely real and well documented. The military needed a radio that could talk to anything, on any frequency, using any protocol. That's a software-defined radio. The Joint Tactical Radio System, or JTRS, pronounced jitters, became one of the Pentagon's most ambitious and, honestly, most troubled programs aimed at solving this. It was supposed to create a family of software-defined radios that could be reprogrammed on the fly to communicate across all branches and with allied forces. The program ran for years, cost billions, and was eventually restructured and partially canceled because the technology and the ambitions didn't quite align with the budget and the timeline. But the underlying idea was sound, and it did eventually bear fruit in various forms. The concept pushed the entire industry forward. What made software-defined radio practical for ordinary people, though, was something much humbler. Around 2012, a bunch of hobbyists and hackers discovered that certain cheap USB TV tuner dongles, little sticks you'd plug into a laptop to watch digital television, contained a chip called the RTL2832U that could be coaxed into acting as a general-purpose software-defined radio receiver. These things cost about $20. You plug one into your computer, attach a simple antenna, download some free software, and suddenly you can tune across a huge swath of the radio spectrum and decode all kinds of signals. Aircraft transponders, weather stations, pager networks, amateur radio, FM broadcasts, trunked radio systems. $20 and some curiosity, and you've got a window into the invisible world of radio that surrounds you. It democratized radio experimentation in a way that hadn't happened since the early days of crystal sets in the 1920s. Remember those kids building simple receivers out of wire and galena crystals and razor blades, pulling voices out of thin air? The RTL SDR dongle was the modern equivalent. It gave a whole new generation the ability to explore the radio spectrum, to actually see signals on a waterfall display, which is a visual representation where frequency runs along one axis and time runs along the other, and signals show up as bright lines or patterns. You can literally watch the radio spectrum in real time, see signals appear and disappear, notice patterns you'd never know were there. It made the invisible visible. And this connects to something beautiful about where radio technology sits right now, in this moment. We've gone from Hertz's spark gap in 1887, where he was just trying to prove Maxwell's theory was correct, to a world where the average person carries a device in their pocket that contains maybe a dozen different radios, cellular radios across multiple bands and generations, Wi-Fi radios on 2 or 3 different frequency bands, Bluetooth, GPS, NFC for contactless payments, and maybe ultra-wideband for precise spatial awareness. Each of these is its own radio system, with its own frequencies, its own modulation scheme, its own protocols. And increasingly, many of them are implemented at least partially in software, running on programmable chips that can be updated and improved without ever touching the hardware. Your phone does something that would have seemed like pure science fiction to Marconi. It simultaneously maintains a cellular connection on, say, 1,900 megahertz using a complex OFDM modulation scheme, while also running a Wi-Fi link at 5 gigahertz using a closely related but different OFDM variant, while also maintaining a Bluetooth connection at 2.4 gigahertz using frequency hopping, that same spread spectrum idea that Hedy Lamarr and George Antheil patented in 1942, while also quietly listening to GPS satellites at 1,575 megahertz, picking up signals so faint that they're actually below the noise floor, weaker than the random static, and using correlation techniques derived from Shannon's information theory to extract the timing data anyway. All of this happening simultaneously in a device that fits in your hand, running on a battery, and none of it interferes with any of the rest because of careful frequency planning, clever filtering, and the mathematical elegance of orthogonal signal processing. Every single piece of that system traces back to something we've talked about tonight. Maxwell's equations describe the waves. Hertz proved they existed. Marconi showed they could carry information. Fleming and de Forest gave us the vacuum tube to amplify and generate them. Armstrong figured out how to receive them clearly, and then invented FM to make them sound beautiful. Shannon told us exactly how much information they could carry. Lamar and Antheil showed us how to spread signals across frequencies for robustness. Fourier's mathematics from the early 1800s gave us the tools to break complex signals into simple components and reassemble them. Yagi and Uda showed how to shape the radiation pattern. And generations of engineers, most of whose names we'll never know, refined and miniaturized and optimized every single piece until the whole system became so reliable and so small and so cheap that we take it completely for granted. And you know, there's something poignant about that. Think about Edwin Howard Armstrong, standing on the 13th floor of his apartment building on the night of January 31st, 1954. Heartbroken and exhausted from years of legal battles, feeling like the world had stolen his life's work. If he could have seen what FM became, not just the FM radio band, but the principle of frequency modulation woven into countless communication systems, the mathematical descendants of his ideas embedded in every modern digital radio. I wonder if it would have changed anything for him. Probably not, honestly. The pain was personal, not technical, but his work endured. His ideas won, even if he didn't live to see the victory. Or think about Heinrich Hertz, who died at just 36 years old in 1894, only 6 years after his groundbreaking experiments, never knowing that the waves he'd demonstrated in that small laboratory in Karlsruhe would reshape civilization. When asked about the practical applications of his discovery, he reportedly said he didn't think there were any, that it was just an experiment that proved Maestro Maxwell was right. Just an experiment. Just the foundation of everything we've talked about for the last couple of hours. That's the thing about fundamental discoveries. The people who make them often can't see where they'll lead, because the path from discovery to application is never straight. It winds through other people's workshops and laboratories and garages, through wars and economic booms and regulatory fights, through failures and accidents and stubborn persistence. Maxwell couldn't have predicted Marconi. Marconi couldn't have predicted Armstrong. Armstrong couldn't have predicted Shannon. Shannon couldn't have predicted that his information theory would enable a teenager in Tokyo to stream video on a phone while riding a bullet train. Each generation builds on what came before, often without fully understanding the foundations they're standing on, and that's okay. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked. And here's one last thing to carry with you as you drift off. Right now, as you're lying there, the room you're in is filled with radio waves. Not metaphorically, literally, physically filled with them. Signals from FM radio stations are passing through you at frequencies around 100 megahertz. Cellular signals at 700, 850, 1900 megahertz and more. Wi-Fi at 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. GPS signals from satellites orbiting 20,000 kilometers above you. Signals that left those satellites about 67 milliseconds ago, traveling at the speed of light. Bluetooth signals, digital television, police and fire radio, aircraft transponders, weather satellite downlinks, signals from deep space, the faint hiss of the cosmic microwave background, the remnant radiation from the Big Bang itself, stretched by the expansion of the universe to microwave frequencies, washing over you right now just as it washes over everything. everywhere, all the time. All of these signals are electromagnetic waves, every single one of them described by Maxwell's equations, every one of them a ripple in the same electromagnetic field that Faraday intuited and Maxwell formalized, and Hertz proved, and Marconi harnessed. They pass through you and around you, and they don't interfere with each other in any meaningful way because they're all at different frequencies, all occupying their own little slice of that vast spectrum, all carrying their own information, all coexisting in the same space at the same time. It's an invisible ocean of information, and you're swimming in it right now, and you always have been, and you always will be. The waves don't stop. They don't sleep. They've been traveling since someone or something generated them, and they'll keep going until they're absorbed, or until they spread out so thin that they fade into the background noise of the universe. Some of the radio waves generated by the earliest broadcasts, those first crude spark-gap transmissions from over a century ago, have been traveling outward at the speed of light ever since. They're more than 100 light-years from Earth by now, impossibly faint, probably undetectable, but technically still out there, still propagating, still carrying the ghost of a signal through interstellar space. And that's a nice thought to fall asleep to, isn't it? That every signal ever transmitted is still out there somewhere, spreading outward in an ever-expanding sphere, getting fainter and fainter, but never quite gone. Hertz's first experiments from 1887, Marconi's first transmissions across the Atlantic, Fessenden's Christmas Eve broadcast of 1906, the distress calls from the Titanic, Armstrong's first FM broadcasts from Alpine, New Jersey, all of it still traveling, still out there in the dark between the stars. The room is quiet now, but it's full of waves. It always has been. And you don't need to think about any of this anymore. You don't need to remember the frequencies or the names or the dates. They'll be there if you want them later. For now, just know that the air around you is humming with a century of human ingenuity. And it asks nothing of you. It just passes through, gentle and constant, like a tide you can't see or hear or feel, carrying everything we've ever wanted to say to each other, everywhere, all at once, at the speed of light. And that's enough. That's more than enough. Let it carry you off to sleep.